structure. Thank you.
Good morning, all of you. Thanks, Mrs. Gangri. In fact, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here and speak about city competitiveness. In fact, I must thank my co-editor, Johnson Paul, who's not able to be here because he was a little unwell. But the topic that we're really discussing here is something very significant in terms of like how the cities are really going to change the very texture of what this economy is all about. If you really talk about India, India has been thriving and it will continue to grow. It is going to dominate the world economic scenario. It's going to drive the growth that is actually happening within this globe. But then if you really talk about India, India cannot actually be looked at from one single umbrella. We cannot say that there is something very significant that's not happening within the states. The driver for growth within the country are the states. There are 28 different realities that we really need to understand and talk about. And within those 28 different realities, we have the cities or the urban agglomerations, which actually drive the economic prosperity. If you really look at the numbers, there's something very interesting. If you talk about Maharashtra, which contributes close to about 16.5% of India's GDP, there are 6 urban centers which contribute 90% of Maharashtra's GDP. That is cities like Aurangabad, Mumbai, Pune, and so on and so forth. And that's the truth for various states. So what happens is that the urban agglomerations are really going to define how things really move on. If I really talk about clusters and the agglomeration of industries, they're also coming near the urban settings. If I really look at the spectrum of states, if we see the kind of contribution that actually happens per capita as well, it is huge within the huge urbanized locations. If I really talk about Delhi, Delhi is one of the finest cities in the country in terms of, say, the per capita incomes. That's actually happening because of the whole huge assimilation of a lot of talent and a lot of resources and a lot of activity. If we talk about trends in population, there is a certain level of growth that's actually happening. But what's really going to happen because of this is that the urban centers are really going to get a lot of problem because of the assimilation that's going to happen in terms of technology. But what's happening here is something very significant in terms of, say, rural and urban divide. The urbanization is one process which is bound to happen. It cannot actually get negated. It is something which is, this is something where people are going to migrate from rural areas to the urban area. This is bound to happen, and what we need to do is we need to actually get ready for it. We do talk about the top cities in the country, but the problem in the Indian context would be solved in terms of creating newer urban agglomerations. We have to talk about the 500 or 600 towns which actually exist in this country, and how do we actually make them more competitive. If you really talk about the total number of towns or the total number of urban agglomerations, there's something very interesting in terms of numbers. But urbanization, without a doubt, is a sign of a developing economy. If you really look at how the things have really moved here, if you really see the urbanization which is signified by the yellow dot, there is something that's happening. But then if you really see the growth of the country also actually has a very similar trajectory with urbanization that is actually happening. So if you really look at the Indian states with high growth, they also have high urbanization. If I talk about Maharashtra, if I talk about Delhi, or if I talk about Tamil Nadu, there is a significant shift that has actually happened. If you really talk about a place like Bihar, Bihar has actually been one of the states which have really found a lot of favor, but it's really at the lower end even today. Its per capita contribution is just about close to 16,000 rupees. But if that is there, why is it actually at such a low ebb? It is lower because of the urbanization tunnel that they've actually gone into. They've not been able to create the right set of cities. But if you really talk about distributions of towns by size, this is how it actually looks like. This is continuously improving and changing, and we are actually going to move into more and more significant number of cities which are really going to rise. This is how the urban India actually looks like. These are the places which are defining the economic activity. If I really talk about the urban areas, if I really talk about any cluster, any industry, they are actually getting centered around this. There is a very interesting skew of how industry is actually moving towards the urban agglomerations. But now this leads us to a very important issue of what we call as competitiveness. And what we mean by competitiveness here is that we really need to talk about productivity, the productivity with which I am able to use my resources. So the challenge is going to be, how do I actually use my land, labor, and capital? When you talk about labor, of course, there are issues in terms of urban, or what you call as demographic opportunity. There is also a whole issue of the demographic nightmare that we could actually be seeing. But now the challenge is going to be, is urbanization one thing which could actually resolve or help us resolve the nightmare or the demographic nightmare that we could be actually sitting on? It is probably going to be happening in the urban areas that we will be in a position to skill our labor. or else we will have to find alternate mechanisms in terms of skilling our labor and actually keeping them in the rural areas. So the biggest challenge is going to be, how do I actually resolve the issue of young population, which is very talented, but we are not able to give them the right employment? How do we actually resolve that issue? In fact, this whole huge thing in terms of, say, urban and rural thing, there's a very interesting example that I always give. Let's talk about healthcare and competitiveness. The idea of healthcare and competitiveness is that when you talk about, say, something like cardiac disease in India, India is going to lose close to about 17 million man-years because of premature cardiac deaths. But most of these premature cardiac deaths, in fact, 50% of them are actually going to happen because of accessibility issues. When I say accessibility, it means that people are either not able to go to the doctor, not able to reach the doctor, or they do not have doctor in the vicinity in a rural setting. So if I really talk about a place like Delhi, 50% of the cardiac deaths that actually happen in a city like Delhi actually happen because primary care was not given to them. So what this means is that there is a significant opportunity that is available to us in terms of creating business models which are going to be hugely different. So what would we do is, like, we could actually create roadside kiosks of really taking care of people who are going to have a cardiac problem. So it's a very simple solution. Give him a sorbitrate, give him an aspirin, and the mortality rates are actually going to go down significantly. So are we really looking at those solutions? So the solutions are going to lie in the problems and looking at those problems in a very unique and an effective way. But then why are we really talking about the cities then? Because cities are going to be the driver for growth, as I actually said. And there are multiple levels of geography at which we could always do the analysis. But the whole idea of competitiveness is a sum total of activity that actually happens at smaller agglomerations like, say, cities. And of course, what are the drivers of competitiveness? The drivers of competitiveness are going to be overall business environment, concentration of resources, or policy coordination. But why do we talk about business environment here? Can we actually talk about business environment at India level or at a state level, or should we actually go on to talk about environment at the city level? In fact, India has actually seen a significant shift that has actually happened in terms of how the federation or the federal structure has actually changed in the last few years. The states have actually become more assertive in terms of taking decisions. But now what they need of the hour is that these states will actually have to give a lot of power to the cities to actually define what they want to be. And how do we actually do that? So that means there is going to be a whole huge proposition that cities will have to have their own sets of visions and so on and so forth. We'll come to that. But then if I really talk about measuring competitiveness, the report that we're just releasing in a few minutes, this is how we actually looked at. These are the 4 fundamental pillars which are actually going to define how competitiveness of a city is actually going to get defined. So factor conditions, demand conditions in terms of, when I said factor conditions, it was land, labor, capital. Demand conditions was what was the sophistication of demand that is actually available. In fact, this is where we actually have to understand one more thing. We do actually talk about the whole huge idea of middle class and so on and so forth, but what we need to really understand is what's really happening at the lower end of the system. There is something like which is significant in terms of rich, but there is a huge opportunity that actually exists at the lower end as well. So can we actually look at solutions which could be presented in the urban settings of that nature, probably about what we call as microfinance to whatever. In fact, one single thing in terms of, say, factor conditions, a lot of us would be surprised. One of the biggest opportunities that actually exists in this country are what we call as sanitation. 63% of people in Delhi defecate in the open. There's a big opportunity, people do not even realize about it. So if there is something that you could actually do in terms of, say, creating a business model around it, the world is at your feet. We just simply try to ignore the opportunities that actually exist here in the system. And when we talk about the hierarchy of index, this is how the index is actually looking at. When we talk about factor conditions to demand conditions of various factors, when I talk about context of strategy and rivalry, it's actually talking about the incentives that the city is able to present. When you talk about a state, or when you talk about a city like Delhi, what is it that city of Delhi is able to present to the business owners? Is it able to provide some incentives to really start businesses and so on and so forth? Last but not the least, it's about institutional support. It is about governance. In fact, the cities that we studied, we looked at a cross spectrum of cities, but then what we see is that there is, if I really talk about a city like Mumbai, Mumbai is an interesting example of how urban agglomeration has actually happened, but then there is a severe issue of density and severe issue of lack of space. I think this is where India could actually learn from Singapore in terms of how city management or how cities need to actually get created and urban agglomerations need to be set right. We could talk about at length in terms of the mess that the cities are here in India, but I think that mess itself presents the opportunity that we actually look at. this is how the rankings actually look like in terms of what are the most competitive cities, what are the right cities to really do business. But now this is where the challenge also really comes up. When I talk about Delhi being one of the most competitive cities in the country, it is ranked lower than 70 in the global competitiveness rankings. In fact, Mumbai is even lower than that. So if you really look at it, like that means at the world level, the Indian cities are actually missing the point. We could actually go gung-ho in terms of whatever has actually happened, but if I really try to benchmark what's really happened across the globe, we need to start working very, very strongly and swiftly how to change it. Singapore being one of the most competitive cities in the world. And then and when you talk about Delhi, it's ranked lower than 60 or 70. How do we actually compare? How do we bridge these gaps? Can we learn? Can we actually create some possibilities of collaboration working together? But then, of course, there is a very strong correlation between population and competitiveness. As population grows, as talent matures, there is going to be a whole huge relationship between competitiveness. Teachers in government schools versus competitiveness. Absolutely a positive correlation. Female literacy. In fact, there is a whole huge challenge of female literacy that we have not actually noticed. But the moment we are able to increase female literacy, the competitiveness of the location starts increasing. If you really talk about urban agglomerations in places like, say, Rajasthan, Punjab, or UP, the female literacy levels are low. So that is actually defining the lower competitiveness ranking of those states or those cities. So what we need to significantly do is get this whole idea right. Give focus on education. There is simply no other single bullet that you could actually feed or single tablet that you could feed to really get things right. Education Development Index versus competitiveness, very clearly. So what I actually said about skilling. Cheating incidents versus competitiveness. In fact, this is something very interesting. A lot of people would think that corruption has absolutely no relationship. In fact, corruption has a whole huge negative impact on how things could actually shift in, say, competitiveness. So there is a significant thing that's happening here. Decadal growth rates and so on and so forth. So what we are really seeing is that there is a significant correlation in what we are really doing and the data that we're seeing. But India for today is not going to be the 4 metros. Or India for tomorrow is not going to be the 4 metros. It's actually going to be the newer cities, the tier 2, tier 3 cities, which are going to be providing one of the most significant opportunities to the world. If I really talk about urbanization level of tier 2 cities, this is how it is. But now the question is going to be, we need to set these cities right. We need to develop them right. In fact, I do not know if quite a lot of us have seen Gurgaon. In fact, I say, if you really want to create an experiment of how not to build a city, it is called Gurgaon. Can we actually improve systems in terms of transportation and so on and so forth? So what's going to happen is the untangling the linkages between city competitiveness and economic growth is going to be about cities tend to be the places where companies will happen and so on and so forth. So we need to actually work the idea of bringing or linking all this together. If I really move ahead, one of the biggest things that's really going to drive it is going to be the urban infrastructure. And what do I mean by urban infrastructure? 2 or 3 very critical things. One is going to be transportation. In terms of like, when I said access, I said like in terms of time that actually takes to really move from one location to the other. In fact, I do not know how many of us actually noticed, if you go to the toll plaza in Gurgaon, it's a significant money earner for Mr. Narula, but at the end of the day, it is also creating or contributing significant losses to the country. We lose 8 man-years every day because of the traffic snags that actually happen at that location. So now this is where the question is going to be, what about economic prosperity? What about wealth creation, accumulation, and shared value? So we will have to get into solutions which do not accumulate wealth with a few and actually at the cost of time of others. When I'm losing 8 man-years every single day, what it means is that we need to actually look at it very, very significantly. We need to change things around. You will have to create other modes of transportation, but the next big thing that we really have to look at within the urban setting is going to be what we call as sanitation. The third one is going to be water. In fact, if I really talk about water per se, there is a significant issue that we are facing today in terms of how water management actually happens. Can we actually set the right thing? So this is one big opportunity that we are actually seeing. But coming to the last few points, we have talked about the urban clusters, and then what are the urban clusters that have actually happened across the cities? So if I talk about Ahmedabad, it's the chemical cluster. When I talk about Raipur, it's iron and steel, and so on and so forth. The question is going to be, can I keep these clusters alive? Can I actually create innovation around in these clusters? We've actually had clusters like the simple thing like a sports good cluster in Jalandhar, but that whole cluster died down. Why? Because we were not innovating, because our universities were not functioning. Because the last time I think the universities really created a lot of value in this country was during the Green Revolution. After that, I think we've actually been creating a bunch of job seekers and nothing else. So if you really talk about any of the institutions, so that's where the whole challenge is. But now the question is going to be, say, something like a success of Bangalore. It is a whole huge thing that you were able to create around education. Bangalore, Hyderabad, there was a whole huge skilling that actually happened. The number of engineering colleges that actually got created there. You have close to about 700,000 engineers which actually pass out of 3 city centers. That is Bangalore, Hyderabad and Chennai. And look at what has actually happened in that part of the world. So this also leads us to a very important issue as to what cities need to actually focus on in terms of the business opportunities and things. Chandigarh can never be an IT city. If you are just trying to do the Chandigarh to become an IT city, we have been trying it for the last 8 years, never happened, will never happen, for a simple reason, because we do not have the right factor conditions to make Chandigarh a great IT city. You will have to work on huge levels of migration to really do it. But now the question is, how many of us are really understanding how to create the right set of cities? Can we learn as to how do we understand the right conditions? Singapore is one of the greatest examples in terms of how it understood its factor conditions and created a whole huge positive orientation in terms of what it would actually do. If I talk about the IT hubs, this is how IT hubs and things look like. This is what the automotive cluster looks like. So it's again around the whole idea of urbanization. Last but not the least, or a few points, when I talk about enhancing city competitiveness, what do we need to do right now? There are going to be 5 steps. Deal with the urbanization rightly. Deal with urban poverty. We cannot ignore it. I think what has happened is in the public debate, in the international fora, we have just not talked about it. There is a whole huge problem that we have to actually talk about. We have to really understand that there are a lot of people in this country who are still poor. Incidentally, if you do look at the numbers, we have actually been going gung-ho about the trickle-down effect and so on and so forth. But one simple point, the Gini index says, or the Gini coefficient tells you, that the disparity in this country has actually increased in the last 20 years. So yes, the whole idea of liberalization has been great, but it has not been inclusive. That's one single point. So we need to look at inclusive agendas, and we would need to drive it through the cities. And of course, when I said the governance mechanisms, we will change, or we will have change, and this is going to present a very interesting opportunity in this country. But of course, one thing that we need to look at is how cities will need to get branded. Cities will have to understand that they need to have their own vision. They will have to have their own value proposition. What is Delhi needs to be known about? What is Gurgaon supposed to be known for? What is, say, Sonipat supposed to be known for, and so on and so forth? Can we actually do that? The biggest thing, or the biggest opportunity is in defining it and moving ahead in the future. Indian cities and global benchmarks, I've already talked about it. But keys for successful cities, as I said, visioning to entrepreneurs, to governance, to social cohesion, to specialization, to openness, and so on and so forth. That's what the future is actually going to be about. So the cities of the future. So present cities seem to be stressed, but we will need to work on the newer urban settings. Some of the cities that we are doing in the index, but I think there are close to about 200 urban agglomerations which are going to drive how things are actually going to be happening. And when you talk about how the man is going to change, how things are going to happen. So there is going to be a challenge in terms of how office work is going to change. So there would be a dramatic shift in terms of work cultures, and so on and so forth. But then the changes in cities are actually going to be driving it. Thank you.